professor at the Quilmes University, member of CONEAL, and member of REACES. Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I wish to deeply thank IOHE, the university here in Loja, and its principal for this invitation. This is not the first time that I have been here, but I was very happy to come back. The organizers of this meeting asked me to state some reflections on the possibilities of building a Latin American space for higher education. I understand, he says, that for that analysis it is a must to place ourselves along some main risks that our continent shares. The key one, to my judgment, is the one that is stated there. Although our continent is not the poorest of all, in reality it is the most unequal. And I'm speaking about the economic, social opportunities which mark all the aspects of our social life and also the life of institutions. A second very interesting characteristic is that for the first time in decades, Latin America faced the worldwide. Of course, we were not untouched. Many of our countries have suffered a significant decrease in GDP. Others have palliated the situation a little better. But the truth is that it hasn't happened as in the past, where we found inflationary earthquakes and a lack of power for national states. Even in this similar situation, we see that our countries had to really take some or adopt some counter-cyclic measures. With this, I want to say that in the first decade of the 21st century, Latin America has a more promising panorama than by the end of last century. That there has been some changes, some improvement, particularly in the distribution of income, slight, and I must say that insufficient. Those main characteristics, I think, are also present in the world of higher education. Why do I say this? We in Latin America live an explosion of numbers of students attending university. Sometimes we complain, we say things are equal, but in the last 30 years, between 75 and 2004, we have gone from 4 to 16 million students. In the past, in the first half of the 20th century, evidently the university world was for a very small and very close elite. All university students knew each other. That made possible for some Latin American countries to sign recognition of degrees and titles, serving the minimum interest in each one of the countries regarding the number of graduate students. But today, it's a different world, and as I tell you, we have over 16 million students. That, of course, in itself means a greater level of inclusion. We see that today growing sectors of the population are being incorporated to the world of higher education. We find that in many countries there are first generations of university attendants in very vast areas of society. But by all means, we also find in turn the permanence, the recurrence of enormous asymmetries in access to higher education. If we divide the population and we observe the capacity of access of the first compared to the last, we're going to see a difference. It's unfair to deal with all countries under the same terms, but we find on the one extreme the giant of Latin America, Brazil, and other countries that have a more balanced situation. If we face that situation in Latin America, if we have these characteristics that are somewhat bold, in my opinion, we have to make an analysis of some of the troublesome areas in the configuration of higher education in order to see the possibility of having a real Latin American space for universities. First characteristics, the national education systems are not articulated. Many times we speak about the possibility of recognizing titles amongst our countries, but the truth of the matter is that partial studies between local universities that sometimes are 500 meters away are not being recognized. We find that under the name of university in the same country, we have the coexistence of very diverse realities. There is all the way from universities that appear in the world rankings. There are universities that are incredibly large in size. There are universities which in some countries are called garage or the ugly duck university. There are institutions that do not deserve the name of universities. There are private and public institutions. So we have to tell you about the enormous complexity in the national education system and an enormous not only complexity but heterogeneity in regards to characteristics, in regards to the traits of students as well as teachers. In third place, I think that it is a must for the existence of a Latin American space for higher education, a review upon the myths of the Latin American university. Luckily, in the last few years, we see the proliferation of studies about the history of our universities, but the truth of the matter is that common sense on the part of officers, on the part of university directive members, go back to the idyllium of what the university of the 20th century has been. Sometimes a story that is excessively romantic is told and that reflects very little reality. If we review the roles of universities in this last century, we see that the role has been very diverse. In some cases, it has been an innovator. In some others, it has been extremely conservative, not only in the academic portion, but also in the areas of research and also in the area of national policies. And the last aspect that we must review is what characteristics should we adjudge to that concept under which many crimes are committed, the concept of quality, in order to serve the diversity that we're speaking about. These four aspects, national education systems that are not articulated, a categorization that serves in the light of diversification and segmentation, which is a Latin American reality, and a multi-plural definition of higher education institutions. I think these are key elements when we have to devise a system or a space for the Latin American higher education. Let's take a closer look at the first one of these traits. We will see them very quickly. I said there's a lack of articulation between higher institutions, higher education institutions. A partial recognition on studies, there's no recognition of degrees or title. In excessive number of situations, there are relationships of universities of one country with universities of a different country rather than inside, and there's a very serious problem in Latin American countries, which is the relationship between secondary education or secondary higher education and university education, Many times university attendants complain, particularly teachers complain about the condition in which secondary students arrived at universities, but we have to remember that secondary education is part of the education system of the country, and there we have a jump, we have a sort of a gap at present, and evidently the university is not responsible 100%, but it has to make its contribution. And finally, in many of our countries, we find an immense lack of articulation between the national state and universities. I'm one who believes, and I tell you in full terms, that yes, indeed, it is possible to have a strong, it's impossible to have a strong higher education system without a strong government. The shortcuts, attempting to save one institution in a country that doesn't work, the truth is that this is going to lead us to failure. And from that point of view, at the university level, we are responsible for the destiny of our own countries. And I think that the lack of articulation in some nations is dramatic, and some other places is less so. But it is always patent, it's always clear when modification or changes are brought about in the world of education. The second aspect, I mentioned it quite a bit, but here I'm simply pointing out some novel traits that speak about the diversification and segmentation at institutional level. You know that throughout 20th century, the Latin American universities were basically professionalist. Unfortunately for us, the research and improvement of staff was almost non-existent, and in general, universities were graduating doctors, lawyers, and the best of cases, engineers, and they had public accountants and those that finished their business education areas, but the ones that have continued this or developed this have been few, and in the last few years we see a small change if we measure, for example, the very insufficient funds that are qualitatively higher than the ones that were available before. Some universities are looking to take this path. Many Latin American universities are stating that one of the essential tasks of a university is research that has a positive value, in the sense that many humble institutions make attempts to show that yes, they do carry out research, and that demand also takes some university professors to renew themselves to look for additional education and training, but in turn it is a demand that leads to a certain level of confusion between what is real and what is ideal. If this situation would occur in the whole world, the level of complexity would be such that you cannot ask all universities to do all functions. And many times we're going to find universities that are extraordinary, that are only teaching, that are transmitting knowledge, and we're going to find mediocre universities that also pretend to do creation of knowledge or generation of knowledge, and I think that that situation should be taken care of. Another element, and I think that this entire Congress, even this table, has devoted its time to this issue, is to make attempts to innovate through virtual education this reality. Unfortunately, a global balance is needed in regards to this policy, but the truth is that there are impressive gains. I ignore the real figures for Latin America. I'm aware a little bit more of the real situation of my country. It is not one of the leading countries in virtual education, but we find a panorama that is rather different in the last 10 years, at least. There have also been very strong policies in the last few years regarding the increase of registration through what I call there the municipalization, or taking the universities to small towns. There are different experiences in this regard, some more successful, some less. We have to mention the ProUne program in Brazil, the Venezuelan program of municipalization, and the Chilean experience with an ideological bias very different to the earlier ones that I mentioned. But through a lot of self-financing and through the popular work, have been able to increase the registration figure significantly in very few years. Also, in regards to the review of university conceptions, we have spoken a little bit, but we have to review what is democratizing higher education, what is this concept of bringing science to universities. There is a very strong idea that targets only to develop professionals, and we have to see how other social sectors participate in the university or higher education world. I'm not referring here only to the demand, the solid demand, the market, but also other social sectors. Forgive me, but I am confused. In regards to quality, I also told you something in advance. Evidently, the concept of quality has an enormous advantage, and it is that it has put over the table in an explicit manner a concern that has been traditional in universities, but that it has been diluted because of the internal dynamics, because of budgetary problems, and it is the concept of quality. The concept itself is polythemic. It is always going to depend on the lens that you're using to see through. There's a series of problems when you make analysis of quality, whether you were talking about the input or the output. What is the output that is sought for? And in this regard, I reviewed a program of the Brazilian government that was measuring the level of knowledge of graduate students. I know the university can think that it is the number of graduate students compared to the number of students admitted, but it is true that if we have a diverse system, we should ask ourselves in turn, how do we go about so that concept continues being the engine of our institutions, continues being an encouraging element for teachers, and also looks for and the integration of Latin America with the world. That's why I put this topic of quality, diversity, and globalization. The concept of quality has also the need to serve not only for the internal traits, the academic traits that the university should have, but also the social and economic demands that come from society itself. This cannot be left to the market forces alone, but there must be some signals, some signs and signals that should guide this university orientation, and I think we should learn from the Bologna case a lot. Finally, quality also implies this critical view and the creation of citizens, something that is present in the World Conference of Countries. To my judgment, he says the 6 actions are, I would say, basic towards the creation of a Latin American space. I'm not going to say anything new. Evidently, I don't have a lot of innovation in this regard. Academic innovation is important. Many times I think this has been corrected, but it has more mobility amongst the central countries rather than amongst all of our countries. A few years ago, a country was offering scholarships so that students from other Latin American countries would go to the first countries, but the scholarships were not filled. Our reality, as I say, is heterogeneous, but it has important quality pockets that sometimes are ignored by our own universities that prefer to send the beneficiaries of scholarships to other continents. Second thing, or an issue that is going to help the first one are the joint programs for graduate and postgraduate. The postgraduate work obviously is easier to be done, but we should also be thinking along the line of the possibility, particularly those countries that are physically closer, that have intercultural relationships, to think along these lines. And in this regard, I would like to tell you the experience of Mercosur. With the accreditation of many of these pre-graduate careers, we have done an interest in mobility, in agronomics, and also in some of the engineering. A third key element is a demand of greater investment on the part of the governments for research and development. It is impossible to create a Latin American space if there is not a growing pace of innovation in the scientific world, in the technological arena. Fourth issue, one of the characteristics of this space, it has to be an active response to the asymmetries between and among countries. Let's think that, for example, nowadays 80-85% of postgraduates in Latin America are concentrated in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. So evidently those asymmetries speak about a serious difficulty at the moment of discussion. And the next point that I make there, it's a confluence of the criteria for assessment and accreditation. I'm not going to develop, this is the area of my work. And finally, I'm saying that we should look for some common legislation items. Recognizing titles is one, but it's not necessarily the most important. But we should find some legislation common points in order to motivate the confluence along this line. And for these minimum actions, we need to strengthen the networks. We have all kinds of networks, university networks. OHE is one of them. There are sub-regional networks, the Amazon network, for example, and along education we have virtual organizations, and we have the Pan American Engineer Association, the one on medicine, communications, etc., all disciplines really. There are networks for assessment and accreditation, such as the one that I participate on. And it is impossible to have a network of networks. ISAC, for example, is proposing the establishing of links, and in a recent meeting of legislators and president of the committees on education of all the congresses in Latin America were proposing the same thing. Is it possible to have a network of networks? In my judgment, in order to have a network of networks, we should be very modest amongst the existing ones. That is, in as we can visualize that one will try to be at a higher level of hegemony than others, there will not be the possibility of having this. And I'm speaking from the governments from Mexico to the south to have an analogous process to the one that was carried out in Europe. Therefore, the objectives that we should pose for ourselves should establish a path, a structure, and we don't try to solve this problem overnight.
We'd like to thank